Imagine standing inside the Colosseum, not as a spectator, but as a resonant object yourself. Stone beneath your feet, stone rising around you, stone shaped, curved, hollowed, layered, stacked with mathematical intent. Now imagine that this stone was never meant only to be seen. It was meant to be heard, to be felt, to vibrate. Because stone does not merely hold weight, stone holds frequency. Every material does. And the Colosseum, more than almost any ancient structure on Earth, appears engineered to turn sound into force, and force into altered states of mind. Long before modern neuroscience named alpha, theta, and delta brainwaves, ancient civilizations understood something intuitive and terrifyingly precise. The human brain is an oscillating organ. It synchronizes, it entrains. It mirrors rhythms it is exposed to. Drums, chants, echoes, footsteps, breath, collective shouting. These are not entertainment tools. They are neurological levers. When repeated rhythms strike the ear at specific intervals, the brain does not resist. It follows. It slows. It synchronizes. And once synchronized, human consciousness becomes malleable. The Colosseum's architecture appears uncannily optimized for this effect. Its elliptical design is not random beauty. Ellipses concentrate sound. They bounce it, recycle it, fold it back into itself. In an ellipse, sound does not escape easily. It travels, reflects, overlaps, and stacks. A shout from the arena floor would not simply rise upward. It would smear itself across the stone walls, return as delayed echoes, interfere with itself, and create standing waves, pockets where vibration becomes sustained rather than transient. These are not just echoes. These are pressure patterns that the human nervous system feels through the chest, the bones, the skull. Roman engineers were masters of acoustic geometry. They built theaters where a whisper could be heard from dozens of meters away. They understood angles, curvature, resonance cavities. Now, imagine that knowledge scaled to the largest amphitheater ever constructed, capable of holding more than 50,000 human bodies. Bodies that themselves produce heat, sound, breath, electromagnetic activity, a living resonant chamber, a biological amplifier wrapped in stone. Modern acoustic researchers who study ancient sites repeatedly notice something unsettling. Certain frequencies dominate. Low-frequency vibrations linger longer than expected. These frequencies fall directly within the range known today to influence human brainwaves. Theta waves, associated with trance, dissociation, and heightened suggestibility, sit between 4 and 8 Hz. Delta waves, associated with dreamlike states and loss of self-boundaries, drop even lower. You do not need speakers to induce them. You need rhythm. You need repetition. You need mass synchronization. Now, imagine the Colosseum during an event not framed as a show, but as a ritual. The crowd arrives already primed. Anticipation raises heart rates. Drums begin. Feet stamp. Voices chant. The sound does not dissipate outward like in an open field. It stays. It circulates. The stone absorbs and re-emits it. The structure becomes a massive acoustic feedback loop. As thousands chant or roar in unison, their voices synchronize unintentionally. Their breathing synchronizes. Their nervous systems begin to lock into the same tempo. This phenomenon is not speculative fantasy. Modern science calls it neural entrainment. When external rhythmic stimuli dominate sensory input, the brain aligns its electrical firing to match. This is why people enter trance states during repetitive drumming ceremonies. This is why chanting mantras alters perception. This is why military marches synchronize soldiers psychologically. Scale it up. Multiply it by tens of thousands. Place it inside a stone structure designed to prevent acoustic decay. Now, you are no longer watching entertainment. You are inside a neurological machine. The Colosseum's hypogeum, the underground chambers, deepen this mystery. Hollow spaces beneath the arena floor act like resonance cavities. Sound does not just travel horizontally, it moves vertically, bouncing between floors, tunnels, and voids. Low frequencies thrive in such environments. They are difficult to localize, making the source of vibration ambiguous. This ambiguity is critical. When humans cannot locate sound, the brain assigns threat or meaning. It heightens emotional arousal. Fear, awe, and submission increase. Add ritual bloodshed to this equation, and the psychological impact multiplies. Extreme emotional stimuli intensify neural plasticity. The brain becomes more receptive to imprinting. The combination of rhythmic sound, collective focus, emotional shock, and architectural resonance creates an altered state not unlike those sought deliberately in ancient initiation rites across cultures. From Mayan temples to Egyptian chambers to Celtic stone circles, sacred architecture repeatedly incorporates enclosed spaces, resonance, and rhythm. The Colosseum fits this pattern far too well to be dismissed as coincidence. Some researchers note that specific standing points within the structure produce unusually strong echo returns, while others dampen sound almost completely. This uneven acoustic distribution suggests intentional tuning. Certain positions amplify, others silence. Imagine priests, officials, or ritual leaders knowing exactly where to stand to command auditory dominance. Their voice would seem omnipresent, disembodied, godlike. Authority reinforced not by force, but by physics. Now consider the crowd itself as an energy system. 50,000 nervous systems oscillating together generate measurable electromagnetic fields, individually weak, collectively significant. Modern experiments show that synchronized groups exhibit coherent bioelectric activity. The Colosseum may have functioned as a resonator not only for sound, but for human energy itself. Stone, especially limestone and travertine, responds subtly to vibration. It stores mechanical energy briefly before releasing it. This creates feedback between structure and occupants, a loop where humans excite the building and the building excites the humans. In such an environment, identity dissolves, individual thought blurs. The crowd becomes a single organism. This is the ideal state for mass psychological conditioning. Loyalty, obedience, catharsis, ideological imprinting. What better place to reinforce the power of empire than inside a machine that temporarily rewires perception itself? Ancient writers describe the Colosseum experience as overwhelming, intoxicating, unforgettable. They lacked the language of neuroscience, but they understood the effect. People left transformed, drained, exalted, bonded to Rome at an emotional level deeper than reason. Entertainment alone does not do that. Spectacle alone does not dissolve individuality. Ritual does. When you strip away modern assumptions and look only at function, the Colosseum begins to resemble less a stadium and more a frequency temple, a place where sound, stone, and biology intersected deliberately, where architecture acted not as backdrop, but as participant, where the true event was not what happened in the arena, but what happened inside the minds of those watching. If this interpretation is even partially true, then the Colosseum was never just about gladiators or games. It was about tuning consciousness, about aligning the masses into a shared psychological state, about using resonance, the most ancient and invisible of tools, to shape belief, memory, and identity. And once you see it that way, a chilling question emerges. If ancient engineers could do this with stone and sound, how much of our modern world still relies on the same principles, hidden in plain sight, disguised as noise, spectacle, and harmless entertainment? Beneath the Colosseum's visible grandeur lies something far more unsettling than stone corridors and storage rooms. What exists below the arena floor does not behave like normal architecture. It behaves like a system, a network, a pattern that feels less like hallways meant for human movement and more like pathways designed for flow. Flow of bodies, yes, but also flow of sound, pressure, energy, timing, and control. When you examine the hypogeum not as a basement, but as a diagram, it stops looking Roman and starts looking eerily technological. At first glance, historians describe the underground tunnels as functional spaces. Cages for animals, lifts for gladiators, pulleys, trapdoors, service corridors. But functionality does not require symmetry at this scale. It does not require layered redundancy, mirrored pathways, choke points, feedback loops, and branching junctions that resemble logic gates. Yet, that is exactly what we find. The hypogeum is not a straightforward maze. It is a deliberately segmented grid, divided into repeating units, nodes, and channels that converge and diverge with almost algorithmic precision. In modern terms, it looks disturbingly similar to circuitry. Circuits are not random. They are designed to regulate flow, to delay it, to accelerate it, to route it conditionally. And when researchers overlay maps of the hypogeum with modern schematics, Even without forcing the comparison, the resemblance is difficult to ignore. Long parallel channels run side by side like conductive pathways. Perpendicular junctions interrupt them at regular intervals. Central corridors act as main buses, distributing movement outward. Smaller chambers behave like capacitors, storing potential. Animals, humans, tension, before release. This is not how you design simple storage tunnels. The underground network allowed absolute control over timing. Gladiators did not wander into the arena. They emerged at precisely chosen moments. Animals did not appear randomly. They rose through trapdoors and synchronized bursts, often accompanied by sound, smoke, and crowd noise above. Every appearance was orchestrated from below, unseen. This invisibility matters. In psychological systems, the source of control is most powerful when it cannot be seen, when effects appear spontaneous, divine, inevitable. But timing control alone does not explain the complexity. The tunnels were over-engineered for logistics. Far simpler layouts could have moved people and animals efficiently. Instead, the hypogeum uses layered routing. Some paths dead-end intentionally, others loop back. Some narrow suddenly, compressing movement. Others widen, allowing accumulation. This creates pressure gradients, not just physical, but psychological. Confinement, anticipation, fear, readiness. Emotional states were engineered below ground before bodies ever reached the light. Now, imagine sound traveling through this system. Stone tunnels do not merely transmit sound, they shape it. Low frequencies travel farther through confined spaces. They bend around corners. They leak upward through gaps, vents, and trapdoors. The hypogeum would have acted like an acoustic processor. Roars from the crowd above would bleed downward, fragmented and distorted. The sounds of chains, breathing, growls, chanting priests, and mechanical lifts would blend into a constant subterranean hum. To someone waiting below, this would not sound like a crowd. It would sound like a living machine. And machines influence behavior. Humans instinctively respond to rhythmic mechanical noise with heightened alertness. Heart rate changes. Cortisol rises. The body prepares for threat. This state makes individuals more reactive, less reflective, more susceptible to command. The hypogeum was not just a waiting area. It was a conditioning chamber, a place where fear, expectation, and submission were amplified before release into the arena. But the circuitry resemblance goes deeper. Some tunnels align directly beneath key focal points above: the Emperor's Box, the central axis of the arena, the main entrances. This vertical alignment suggests intentional coupling between underground activity and surface experience. When something happened below, it affected what happened above. Vibrations, sounds, even subtle ground tremors would rise through the stone. The crowd may not have consciously noticed, but their bodies would have felt it. The structure behaved as a coupled system. Inputs below, outputs above. This is how feedback systems work. In advanced control systems, you do not isolate components. You link them so that changes in one layer influence another. The hypogeum appears designed to modulate the arena's atmosphere in real time. Release more animals. Increase chaos. Delay emergence. Increase tension. Introduce rhythmic machinery noise. Heighten arousal. Silence below. Create suspense above. These are not theatrical tricks alone. They are nervous system manipulations. There is also the question of energy circulation. Ancient cultures did not separate physical and energetic concepts the way modern science does. Flow was flow, of blood, breath, sound, spirit. The hypogeum's branching channels resemble meridians in traditional medicine diagrams, points where pathways intersected mirror acupuncture nodes, places of heightened sensitivity and control. Whether symbolic or functional, the parallel is striking. The Colosseum may have been conceived as a body, the arena its heart, the hypogeum its nervous system. Blood spilled above would seep downward, literally. Fluids drain through stone, smell travels, heat travels. This downward flow would mix with the confined underground environment, saturating it with sensory signals associated with death and sacrifice. Those waiting below were not separate from what happened above. They were immersed in it before ever stepping into view. This creates continuity, a ritual circuit where death energy cycles through structure and participants. Some tunnels were later destroyed or sealed, raising uncomfortable questions. Why remove access to certain paths? Why erase specific chambers? If the hypogeum were purely functional, preservation would pose no ideological threat. But if it encoded methods of control, ritual process, or symbolic power, erasure would make sense. Empires change, but they rarely want their mechanisms exposed. The more you examine the underground layout, the more it resists casual explanation. It is too ordered to be improvised, too complex to be merely practical, too aligned with psychological impact to be accidental. The hypogeum looks less like a basement and more like a processor, a place where raw human inputs were shaped, timed, and transformed before being released into a massive collective consciousness event above. And this leads to a disturbing reinterpretation. What if the Colosseum was not primarily a stage, but an interface? What if the real machinery was never visible? The crowd thought they were watching violence, but they were participating in a system that routed emotion, fear, and awe through stone channels beneath their feet. A system designed not just to display power, but to generate it. Because in advanced systems, power does not announce itself. It circulates quietly, efficiently, invisibly, just like electricity, just like information, just like belief. If ancient Rome understood this, if they built circuitry before silicon, networks before computers, then the Colosseum stands not as a relic of brutality, but as evidence of something far more unsettling. That long before modern technology, humans already knew how to build machines out of architecture, ritual, and the human nervous system itself. Ancient writers describe something happening inside the Colosseum that is far more disturbing than cheers, screams, or excitement. They struggled to explain it, often defaulting to poetic language, religious metaphors, or vague descriptions of madness, possession, or divine presence. But when you strip away the limitations of their vocabulary, what remains sounds eerily similar to what modern psychology would call shared hallucination, a collective alteration of perception occurring simultaneously across thousands of people. Roman historians repeatedly mention crowds becoming as one mind, not metaphorically, literally. Accounts speak of spectators reacting before events occurred, roaring in anticipation before fighters emerged, gasping at invisible threats, or falling into sudden, synchronized silence without any visible cause. This is not normal crowd behavior. This is predictive response, the kind that happens when perception itself is being influenced, not just emotion. Some records describe moments when the arena seemed larger than life, where fighters appeared monstrous, almost superhuman, or where blood seemed brighter, thicker, and unreal. Others mention sensations of time distortion, events feeling stretched, slowed, or compressed. People reported leaving exhausted, disoriented, unable to fully recall sequences, yet deeply emotionally imprinted. These are classic markers of altered states of consciousness. Shared hallucinations are rare, but they are not mythical. Modern cases occur under very specific conditions: sensory overload, rhythmic stimulation, emotional intensity, confinement, and synchronized attention. The Colosseum provided all of these at unprecedented scale, tens of thousands of people focused on a single point. Continuous rhythmic sound, heat, smell of iron and blood, visual repetition, anticipation, fear, awe, authority presence, all inside a stone enclosure engineered to recycle sound and vibration. Under these conditions, the brain's filtering mechanisms begin to break down. Normally, your brain separates internal imagery from external reality. But when neural entrainment occurs, when brainwaves synchronize with external rhythms, that boundary weakens. Imagery bleeds outward, suggestibility increases. If thousands of brains enter similar wave states simultaneously, their interpretations begin to align. They don't see the same hallucination by chance. They are guided into it by shared stimulus. Ancient accounts hint at this alignment repeatedly. There are descriptions of shadows moving where nothing stood, of faces appearing in the sand, of the arena floor seeming to breathe or pulse. These are not literal events. They are perceptual distortions, the mind filling gaps under stress and resonance. But what makes these accounts extraordinary is that they were reported by many, not individuals. Crowds screaming at threats that weren't there, crowds recoiling before violence occurred, crowds falling silent as if sensing something unseen. These are not reactions to spectacle alone. They are signs of collective perception drift, when a group temporarily shares a distorted reality. One Roman philosopher described the Colosseum experience as a sickness of the eyes and ears. Another warned that even disciplined men left changed in their inner nature, carrying images that did not fade. Gladiatorial games were said to enter the soul through the senses. That phrasing is revealing. They did not say memory. They said entry. As if something crossed a boundary. In some accounts, spectators claimed to feel watched, not by officials or guards, but by something vast and unseen. Others wrote of an overwhelming presence filling the structure, something greater than the sum of people inside it. Modern readers dismiss this as religious awe, but neuroscience offers another explanation. When identity dissolves in large synchronized groups, the brain often externalizes the sensation, interpreting the collective consciousness as an external entity. This phenomenon appears in modern rave culture, religious revivals, mass hypnosis events, and cult rituals. Participants describe a presence, a force, a spirit. It feels external, but it is generated internally by synchronized neural activity. The Colosseum may have been producing this effect deliberately. There are also reports of emotional contagion reaching extreme levels. People fainting en masse, others laughing uncontrollably during violence, some crying without understanding why. Emotional responses detach from rational context. This detachment is critical. When emotion is uncoupled from logic, the mind becomes programmable. Beliefs can be reinforced without resistance. Ancient authorities understood this intuitively. They warned senators against attending too frequently. They discouraged philosophers from exposing themselves to the games. Why would leaders fear entertainment? Because they recognized its power to alter judgment, to bypass reason, to imprint loyalty or cruelty directly into the nervous system. One particularly chilling account describes a crowd convinced a fallen gladiator had risen, even as his body lay motionless. The belief spread instantly. Cheers erupted. Panic followed. Guards intervened. Later writers dismissed it as hysteria, but hysteria does not synchronize so cleanly without a trigger. Hallucination does. The Colosseum created an environment where perception itself could be shaped, where what people thought they saw mattered less than what they felt they saw. And when enough people feel the same unreal thing, it becomes socially real. Memory encodes it. Myth grows from it. Power exploits it. This raises an unsettling possibility. The events inside the Colosseum may not have ended when the games ended. Altered states do not snap back cleanly. They linger. Images persist. Emotional associations harden. People leave more bonded to the group identity, more receptive to authority, more detached from individual empathy. This is exactly what an empire requires. Entertainment distracts. Ritual transforms. The Colosseum did not merely distract Rome. It transformed its people repeatedly, rhythmically, predictably. It trained them to share perception, to feel as one, to dissolve into the mass. Shared hallucination is not a bug in such a system. It is a feature. And if ancient Rome could induce collective altered reality using stone, sound, blood, and crowd synchronization, then the idea that the Colosseum was only a sports arena becomes increasingly difficult to defend. It begins to look more like a consciousness engine, a place where reality itself bent under the weight of synchronized human minds. The most disturbing thought is not that ancient people hallucinated together. It is that they were guided into it, that architecture, ritual timing, and sensory engineering combined to create moments where truth blurred, identity dissolved, and belief could be rewritten. Because once a crowd learns to see together, it can also be taught what to see. And that is a power far older and far more dangerous than any modern technology. There is a reason ancient sources speak of the Colosseum as a place that felt heavier after blood was spilled. Not morally heavier, physically heavier, as if the air thickened, as if the ground absorbed something that did not fully disappear. Roman writers did not describe the arena as being dirty after rituals of death. They described it as being charged, sated, or fed. Those words matter. They imply interaction, not aftermath, exchange, not residue. Blood was never treated as waste in ancient ritual logic. Blood was energy. Blood was currency. Blood was signal. Across nearly every ancient civilization, blood was believed to carry more than life. It carried identity, memory, intention, and force. It was the densest substance a living being could offer without total annihilation. That belief did not originate in superstition alone. Blood is warm. Blood conducts electricity. Blood carries iron. Blood responds to electromagnetic fields. Even today, modern science recognizes blood as a complex bioelectric medium. Ancient people did not need equations to feel its power. They watched what happened when it flowed. Inside the Colosseum, blood did not simply spill onto sand and vanish. It soaked downward. It drained through layers of stone, wood, and earth. The arena floor was designed to be porous, replaceable, absorptive. This was practical, yes, but practicality does not explain why the drainage system funneled fluids into specific underground zones rather than dispersing them randomly. The hypogeum beneath the arena became a collection basin, a convergence point. Everything poured downward. This creates a disturbing possibility. What if the bloodshed above was never meant to end on the surface? What if the true ritual space was below? Ancient ritual theory often emphasizes the idea of feeding the ground. Sacred sites were activated by sacrifice, not symbolically, functionally. Blood was believed to awaken dormant forces, to strengthen invisible fields, to stabilize thresholds between worlds. The Colosseum sat atop layers of earlier sacred ground, including burial zones and ritual sites predating imperial Rome. Building over such places was not accidental. Empires often appropriate older sacred sites precisely because they are already alive in the cultural psyche. Repeated sacrifice in the same location does something psychologically powerful. It anchors meaning. But repeated sacrifice may also do something physically measurable. Modern experiments show that intense emotional events can imprint environments, not mystically, neurologically, and behaviorally. People react differently in spaces associated with trauma or awe, even without knowing the history. The Colosseum magnified this effect by repetition at industrial scale, tens of thousands of deaths over centuries. Blood repeatedly introduced into the same confined system. Heat, vibration, sound, electromagnetic activity, human focus, all converging. If ancient people believed in energy fields, this would be the ideal method to strengthen one, layer by layer, ritual by ritual, generation by generation. Some Roman texts refer obliquely to the arena as being awakened before major games. Priests performed rites beneath the stands. Incense burned below ground, not above. Offerings were placed in underground chambers. Why below? Because in ritual logic, the underworld is where power accumulates. The surface is display. The underground is activation. There are also accounts of gladiators touching the sand before combat, smearing blood deliberately, pressing hands to the ground. This is often dismissed as superstition or gesture, but gestures persist when they do something. These acts mirror older sacrificial practices where blood contact with earth was essential. The arena floor was not neutral ground. It was a conduit. If you combine this with the acoustic and structural properties already discussed, a picture begins to form. Blood spilled above, sound and vibration pressed downward, human fear and attention focused inward, all of it feeding into a contained subterranean system. This is not how you dispose of waste. This is how you charge a battery. Ancient cultures frequently believed that repeated sacrifice created a presence, not metaphorically, operationally. Gods were not omnipresent abstractions. They were localized forces that needed sustenance. The more blood offered, the stronger the presence became. Whether one interprets this spiritually or psychologically, the effect is similar. People begin to feel something is there. Roman crowds often described the Colosseum as feeling alive, not exciting. Alive. They reported sensations of being watched from below, of pressure rising from the ground, of unease that could not be explained by violence alone. These sensations intensified during large-scale executions and mass slaughters. That correlation is critical. Shared belief amplifies perception. If thousands believe blood strengthens the ground, their nervous systems respond accordingly. Expectation primes sensation. Sensation reinforces belief. A feedback loop forms. Over time, the field becomes real, not because of metaphysics, but because of conditioned human response. But there is another layer that cannot be ignored. Blood contains iron. Iron responds to magnetism. Large amounts of blood in a confined stone and metal structure undergoing constant vibration could theoretically influence localized electromagnetic conditions. Even small shifts can affect the human nervous system. We know low-frequency electromagnetic fields influence mood, anxiety, and perception. The Colosseum combined iron-rich blood, mass human bioelectric activity, rhythmic sound, and architectural containment. If you were trying to create a psychoactive environment without chemicals, this would be a method. Ancient engineers may not have known the words electromagnetic field, but they understood cause and effect. They observed what worked. They repeated it. Ritual systems evolve empirically. Practices that produce results persist. Those that don't, vanish. Why else would Rome continue blood games for centuries, even when they were economically inefficient and politically risky? Because they worked. Not as entertainment, but as stabilization technology. They reinforced collective identity. They diffused unrest. They synchronized emotion. They reminded people of power, not just imperial power, but something deeper, older, and more overwhelming. There are whispers in late Roman texts of officials fearing that the Colosseum had become too powerful, that the games stirred forces that were difficult to control, that the crowd sometimes turned unpredictable, volatile, possessed. When Christianity rose and blood sacrifice was condemned, the Colosseum's function collapsed rapidly. Not slowly, rapidly, as if something essential had been removed from the system. If the arena was merely for entertainment, it could have been repurposed easily. Instead, it decayed, was abandoned, feared, avoided. Medieval Romans believed the site was haunted. Not metaphorically, actively dangerous. A place where unseen forces lingered. A place where rituals had gone too far. Whether one interprets the field beneath the arena as psychological conditioning, bioelectromagnetic resonance, collective belief reinforcement, or something more speculative, the pattern remains consistent. Blood was not incidental. It was central. It was the fuel. The most unsettling realization is this. Ancient Rome may have discovered that violence, when ritualized and repeated in controlled architectural environments, produces something tangible, a force that binds crowds, a presence that commands attention, a field that persists beyond individual lives. And if that is true, then the Colosseum was not just a monument to cruelty. It was a machine that ran on blood, not to entertain the masses, but to shape them, to synchronize them, to remind them at a level deeper than thought that power does not merely rule, it resonates. And once something begins to resonate with enough intensity, it does not simply disappear when the noise stops. It lingers. It waits, buried beneath stone, memory, and sand, still charged by what was fed to it long ago. When you look at the Colosseum floor today, you see ruins, gaps, exposed substructures. But when ancient spectators looked down, they saw a carefully designed surface, layered with sand, wood, markings, divisions, and geometry that was never meant to be decorative. Floors in ritual architecture are not neutral. They are maps. And the more closely researchers study the spatial patterns of the Colosseum's arena, the harder it becomes to ignore a disturbing parallel. The geometry aligns unnervingly well with ancient models of planetary energy grids. Ancient civilizations did not imagine the Earth as inert rock. They imagined it as a living body. Veins, nodes, currents, breath. Different cultures used different names. Ley lines, dragon paths, serpent currents, world arteries. But the idea was the same. Certain points on Earth were believed to concentrate energy, amplify intention, and thin the boundary between layers of reality. Temples were not built anywhere. They were placed precisely, repeatedly, obsessively. Rome inherited this knowledge. It did not invent it. It absorbed it, systematized it, weaponized it. The Colosseum sits at a convergent zone long considered potent, even before imperial construction. Earlier Italic and Etruscan traditions marked the area as ritually active ground, burial sites, ceremonial pits, offerings to underworld deities. Rome did not erase these meanings. It built over them, locking them inside stone and geometry. That matters, because in ancient energy theory, overlaying geometry onto a node does not cancel it. It focuses it. Now consider the arena floor itself. The ellipse is not just an architectural solution for sightlines. In sacred geometry, the ellipse represents orbital motion, two focal points bound by a continuous curve. This mirrors planetary paths, celestial mechanics rendered in stone. Energy is believed to circulate differently in curved enclosures than in angular ones. Instead of dispersing, it loops. The arena floor was divided into zones radiating from the center, intersected by axes aligned to cardinal directions, north-south, east-west. This is not accidental. Cardinal alignment is foundational in geomantic traditions worldwide. Aligning structures to these directions was believed to synchronize human activity with planetary rotation, solar movement, and magnetic flow. You don't do this for entertainment, you do it for attunement. Some reconstructions suggest that the arena markings formed concentric patterns beneath the sand, rings within rings. These resemble ancient diagrams of planetary spheres. In Roman cosmology, the universe was structured in layered heavens, each associated with a planetary force: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, the Moon. These were not abstract gods, they were active influences believed to shape human fate and collective behavior. Blood spilled at the center of such a diagram was not random. It was symbolic activation. Center point sacrifice is a recurring ritual motif because the center is where forces converge, the axis mundi, the world pillar, the place where above and below communicate. The Colosseum's arena was designed as a literal central point, surrounded by ascending rings of spectators, like concentric shells of awareness focused inward. That focus matters. Planetary grid theory, even in modern fringe research, emphasizes one core principle: energy follows attention. Places become powerful because humans repeatedly direct emotion, belief, and intention toward them. The Colosseum did this with brutal efficiency. Tens of thousands focused on the same center, over and over, for centuries. Fear, awe, rage, devotion, loyalty, all poured inward. The floor patterns channeled this focus. Lines guided the eye. Symmetry stabilized perception. Repetition induced trance. These are known psychological effects of geometric environments. Mandalas do this. Labyrinths do this. Sacred floors do this. The Colosseum floor functioned as a massive mandala of violence. Some ancient descriptions hint that certain days were chosen deliberately for major games, days associated with planetary alignments. Mars for war, Saturn for death, the Sun for imperial authority. This timing is not superstition. It is synchronization. Ritual efficacy was believed to increase when terrestrial action mirrored celestial movement. As above, so below. If the floor geometry echoed planetary order, then events staged upon it were symbolically inserted into that order. Gladiators were not just fighters. They were offerings aligned to cosmic forces. Executions were not just punishment. They were recalibrations. Public death mapped onto universal structure. Now add the underground systems beneath the floor. Vertical shafts, lifts, trapdoors. These punctured the arena surface at specific points. Not randomly, strategically. From an energy grid perspective, vertical channels are critical. They allow movement between layers, earth to surface, surface to sky, underworld to living world. Every trapdoor was a temporary rupture in the plane. Imagine standing above one of these points without knowing why it feels different. A subtle chill, a sense of anticipation. Humans are extremely sensitive to environmental cues, especially in emotionally charged settings. If certain floor locations consistently triggered stronger reactions, they would quickly gain symbolic weight. Ritual leaders would notice, adjust, exploit. Roman augurs were trained to read space. They believed land itself communicated divine will. Patterns on the ground were messages. The Colosseum floor would have been read not just architecturally, but divinationally. A map of power. Skeptics argue this is coincidence, that geometry is inevitable in large construction, that humans impose meaning retroactively, that Rome was practical, not mystical. This argument collapses the moment you remember that Roman religion saturated every aspect of public life. No building of this scale was secular, none. Every cornerstone involved sacrifice. Every alignment was deliberate. Every major structure was consecrated. The Colosseum was consecrated repeatedly. And here is the uncomfortable part. Modern researchers mapping global ley lines have noted that Rome sits on a major intersection. Whether one believes in ley lines as physical phenomena or psychological constructs, their power lies in repetition of belief. Rome was believed to be the center of the world, All roads led there. That belief alone reshapes perception. When you place the empire's most intense ritual machine on that symbolic center, you amplify its effect exponentially. The arena floor was the focal point of the focal point. A bullseye. Crowds reported sensations of alignment, of destiny unfolding, of history happening. These feelings are not random. They arise when individual identity dissolves into something larger. Geometry helps this happen. It stabilizes group focus. It reduces cognitive noise. It funnels awareness. The Colosseum did not need altars covered in symbols. The entire structure was the symbol. The floor was the diagram. The crowd was the activation mechanism. If planetary energy grids sound too mystical, strip away the language and look at function. The Colosseum concentrated attention, emotion, and belief at a single physical point with relentless repetition. It reinforced Rome's cosmic legitimacy. It made power feel inevitable, ordained, universal. That is what planetary symbolism does. It removes the human scale. It replaces it with fate. And once people believe power is cosmic, they stop resisting it. The most disturbing possibility is not that the floor matched some invisible grid. It's that humans are wired to respond to ordered geometry and symbolic alignment, whether we believe in it or not. Our brains evolved under skies full of patterns. We read meaning into circles, axes, centers. Rome understood this intuitively. So when blood soaked into a floor designed like a cosmic diagram, when sound reverberated through stone aligned to cardinal directions, when crowds synchronized their fear and awe toward a single center, something powerful emerged. Not magic, conditioning. Myth made real through architecture. The Colosseum floor was not a stage. It was a map of how Rome saw the universe and how it wanted its people to feel within it. Small, synchronized, and bound to an order far larger than themselves. If that order happened to look planetary, cosmic, inevitable, that was not an accident. That was the point. And once you understand that, the Colosseum stops being a relic of the past and starts looking like a prototype, a reminder that long before satellites and screens, humans already knew how to align minds by aligning space. When people think of Roman symbols, they instinctively translate them through a modern lens. Domination, conquest, military authority, political power. Eagles mean empire, fasces mean control, standards mean war. But this interpretation may be fundamentally flawed, because to the ancient mind, symbols were not labels, they were instruments. They did not merely represent ideas, they activated states. And when you re-examine Roman symbolism through that older lens, a different pattern emerges. These were not icons of violence, they were symbols of frequency. Ancient cultures did not separate meaning from vibration. A symbol was not static. It was alive. It carried rhythm, proportion, repetition. It was meant to be seen, repeated, marched with, chanted over, carved into stone, embedded into architecture. Symbols were designed to synchronize the human nervous system, to tune perception, to align collective emotion. Rome understood this deeply. Take the Roman eagle. Modern interpretations reduce it to a predator symbol, dominance from above. But the eagle was sacred long before Rome weaponized it politically. It represented the ability to ride thermals, invisible currents. The eagle does not fight the air, it harmonizes with it. Ancient observers knew this. The eagle symbol encoded the idea of alignment with unseen forces, not brute strength. It was a symbol of attunement, not aggression. Now consider the fasces, the bundle of rods bound together around an axe. Today it is read as authoritarian power, but that reading ignores its deeper structure. Multiple identical rods bound into a single unit, individually weak, collectively strong. This is not a weapon metaphor. It is a resonance metaphor. Identical elements oscillating together amplify force. In physics, synchronized oscillators produce greater output. In human systems, synchronized bodies produce mass influence. The fasces symbol encodes frequency coherence. Uniformity creates amplification. Roman standards were covered in repeating geometric motifs, circles, spirals, radial lines. These are not martial necessities. They are visual frequencies. Repetition induces entrainment. When thousands march behind the same symbol, wearing the same shapes, moving at the same pace, breathing at the same rhythm, something happens neurologically. Individual brainwaves begin to align. This is not ideology, it is biology. Roman rituals always paired symbols with rhythm: drums, chants, footsteps, horns. Symbols were never passive. They were always activated by sound and movement. A symbol without rhythm is decoration. A symbol with rhythm is programming. Even Roman numerals reveal this logic. They are not optimized for calculation. They are optimized for repetition and pattern recognition. X, V, 1, simple strokes, easily carved, easily remembered, easily replicated. These shapes recur endlessly across Roman structures. Repetition stabilizes cognition. It reduces uncertainty. It creates psychological comfort within hierarchy. You feel order even if you do not understand it. Now look at Roman architecture itself. Columns are not merely structural. They are vertical repetitions, stone waves frozen in place. Standing columns create visual rhythm. They guide the eye upward and downward repeatedly. This induces a subtle trance-like focus. Greek temples did this first. Rome scaled it to empire size. In the Colosseum, symbols were not confined to banners or shields. They were embedded into the building: the repeating arches, the tiered rings, the symmetrical entrances, the radial segmentation. This is not aesthetics. This is frequency architecture. The structure itself vibrates psychologically before it vibrates physically. Ancient thinkers believed that certain shapes resonated with cosmic order. Circles represented eternity. Squares represented stability. Triangles represented transformation. Rome combined these relentlessly, not because they looked powerful, but because they felt inevitable, cosmic, aligned. Mars, the god most associated with Rome, is misunderstood. Mars was not originally a god of war. He was a god of vital force, growth, motion, spring. Only later did he become militarized. His festivals were rhythmic, cyclical, seasonal. His symbolism was tied to pulse, the pulse of life, the pulse of blood, the pulse of time. Frequency again. Roman religious symbols were activated on specific days, at specific hours, under specific celestial conditions. This is not superstition, it is timing. Frequency is not just shape. It is when something happens. A symbol used at the wrong moment is inert. Used at the right moment, it transforms perception. This is why Roman ceremonies felt overwhelming. People reported feeling swept up, absorbed, altered. Not persuaded, altered. Symbols did not argue. They resonated. Even Latin itself was a frequency tool. Short, percussive words, heavy consonants, rhythmic structure. Chants and proclamations were designed to hit the ear like drums. Language as vibration, not explanation. You do not need to understand Latin to feel its authority. That is not accidental. Modern power relies on persuasion. Ancient power relied on synchronization. When Roman crowds entered the Colosseum, they were surrounded by symbols arranged not randomly, but harmonically. Repetition above, repetition below, repetition around. Banners, architecture, ritual gestures, sound, movement, all reinforcing the same rhythm. This created a field, a psychological field, a frequency environment. Within that environment, violence took on a different meaning. It was not chaos, it was punctuation, a spike in amplitude. The crowd's nervous system was already synchronized. The event simply drove it deeper. Fear and awe ride the same neural pathways. Both increase suggestibility. This reframes Roman cruelty entirely. The goal was not suffering, the goal was resonance. Suffering was just the most efficient stimulus available at the time. Symbols reinforced this resonance continuously. They reminded people where they were, who they belonged to, what rhythm they moved within. Step out of rhythm and you feel dissonance, shame, fear. This is how order maintains itself without constant force. When Christianity rose, it did not merely oppose Roman gods, it opposed Roman frequency. It replaced geometric symbols with narrative ones, stories instead of shapes, meaning instead of resonance. This shift destabilized Roman systems because it changed how belief propagated. The Colosseum could not function in a narrative religion. It required resonance, not doctrine. This is why many Roman symbols were later demonized or stripped of meaning, not because they represented war, but because they worked. They influenced people beneath conscious awareness. They synchronized behavior without debate. Even today, remnants persist, flags, logos, stadium chants, national anthems, marching, repetition. These are not rational tools, they are frequency tools. Rome did not invent them, Rome perfected them. So when you see Roman symbols carved into stone, do not ask what they mean. Ask what they do. Ask how often they repeat. Ask where they are placed. Ask what rhythms accompany them. Because meaning is secondary. Effect is primary. The Colosseum was filled with symbols not to glorify violence, but to tune the crowd, to align tens of thousands of nervous systems into a single oscillation, to make the empire feel like a natural law rather than a political construct. War destroys, frequency binds. Rome did not rule the ancient world because it fought better. It ruled because it resonated better. It understood that humans are not governed primarily by logic, but by rhythm, repetition, and shared vibration. Symbols were the tuning forks of civilization. And once you see Roman symbolism as frequency encoding rather than power signaling, the Colosseum stops being a monument to brutality and becomes something far more unsettling, a prototype for mass psychological synchronization, a place where stone, sound, symbol, and blood combine to produce not obedience, but alignment. Because aligned people do not need to be forced, they move together automatically, and that may have been Rome's greatest invention. There are fragments in Roman literature that do not survive as complete texts, only as quotations, criticisms, condemnations, or dismissive references by later writers. These fragments are dangerous because they point to ideas someone wanted forgotten. Among the most unsettling of these are scattered mentions of something referred to obliquely as the awakening of the stone or the stirring of the rings. No surviving author explains this directly. They speak around it. They warn against it. They mock it. They condemn it as old superstition. But the fact that it appears at all tells us something important. You do not warn people away from something meaningless. In Roman architectural language, rings did not only refer to jewelry or armor. The word was also used to describe circular stone courses, concentric structural layers, and resonant architectural bands. The Colosseum was composed of stacked rings, both visible and invisible, rings of arches, rings of seating, rings of corridors, rings of stone locked together with iron clamps. When ancient writers spoke of stone rings, they were not speaking metaphorically. They were describing the body of the structure itself. What does it mean to awaken stone? To the modern mind, stone is inert, dead, passive. But to the ancient world, stone was memory made solid. Stone held history. Stone absorbed sound. Stone responded to vibration. Stone was not alive, but it was not empty either. Many ancient cultures believed stone could be activated through ritual, sound, and sacrifice. Not animated like a creature, but brought into a responsive state, a state where it interacted with human intention. There are lost references to Roman engineers consulting priestly specialists before major renovations or rededications of public structures. These specialists were not concerned with stability alone. They were concerned with harmony, with balance, with whether a structure was asleep or awake. This language appears again and again in hostile Christian critiques written centuries later, where pagan rituals are described as attempts to wake the stones with blood and noise. Noise matters here. Stone responds to vibration. This is not mystical. It is physical. Sustained low-frequency sound can cause stone structures to resonate. Anyone who has stood near massive bells or chanting in enclosed stone spaces knows this sensation. The vibration moves through the chest, through the bones, through the ground. Multiply that by thousands of voices, drums, horns, and screaming crowds repeated over decades, and you create a persistent vibrational environment. Now, imagine those vibrations traveling through concentric stone rings designed to reflect, trap, and recycle sound. This is where the idea of awakening becomes disturbing. Some late Roman commentators mention that the Colosseum was believed to respond during certain games, not collapse, not shake visibly, respond, as if the structure itself participated. There are accounts of unusual echoes, delayed roars, sounds seeming to originate from beneath the arena or from the walls themselves. Modern acoustics would call this complex reverberation. Ancient observers called it the voice of stone. There are also references to ritual moments occurring before dawn when the arena was empty, chanting beneath the seating tiers, drumming within the corridors, offerings placed at specific points in the substructure. These were not public ceremonies. They were preparatory, activation rites. The goal was not to entertain crowds, but to prepare the building itself. Why prepare a building? Because in ancient ritual logic, structures were participants, not containers. A temple did not merely house a god, it allowed the god to manifest. A sacred space had to be awakened, aligned, fed. Otherwise, it was just stone. The Colosseum was not officially a temple, but it functioned like one in every other respect. It gathered mass attention. It focused emotion. It concentrated sound and blood. And according to these lost references, it required periodic reactivation. The stone rings had to be awakened so the system would function properly. There is a chilling implication here. If the stone rings could be asleep, they could also be overawakened. Some records hint at fear. Fear that the Colosseum was becoming unstable in a way that had nothing to do with engineering. That the atmosphere during games grew increasingly volatile. That crowds behaved unpredictably. That events spiraled beyond intended control. These concerns appear alongside mentions of excessive rituals, too much blood, too much sound, too much stimulation. Awakening is not always desirable. In many ancient traditions, awakening dormant forces carried risk. Once something responded, it could not always be quieted easily. Ritual manuals often include warnings about balance, moderation, and closure. Yet Rome thrived on excess. Bigger crowds, louder games, more deaths, more spectacle. If the Colosseum functioned as a resonant system, then each escalation increased the amplitude. Stone rings under constant excitation do not simply return to baseline. They retain stress. Microfractures form. Resonance patterns shift. Not enough to collapse a structure, but enough to alter how it behaves acoustically and psychologically. Ancient observers may not have understood material science, but they understood pattern. They noticed when a place felt different. There are hints that some rituals were attempts not to awaken, but to calm, to settle the stone, to reduce the intensity. Incense, silence, fasting days, closures. These attempts often failed. The games continued. The system demanded input. When Christianity rose, it did something radical. It stopped the rituals abruptly. Blood sacrifice ended. Chanting ceased. The Colosseum fell silent. Not gradually, suddenly. And something strange happened in the cultural imagination. The site became feared, avoided, described as haunted. Not because ghosts appeared, but because people reported sensations of unease without cause, a lingering pressure, a sense that the structure retained something. This is exactly what you would expect if generations believed a place had been awakened and never properly closed. Lost records also mention the rings listening. This phrase appears once in a fragment quoted to criticize pagan absurdity. Listening stone sounds ridiculous unless you understand it symbolically. To listen is to respond to input, to be receptive, to be part of a circuit. The Colosseum's rings listen to sound, to vibration, to human focus. They responded by amplifying it, feeding it back into the crowd. A loop. Awakening the stone rings may have meant bringing the Colosseum into a state where it functioned optimally as a resonance engine, where sound traveled correctly, where emotions synchronized efficiently, where the crowd felt overwhelmed, unified, and transformed. This reframes everything. The Colosseum was not a passive stage that occasionally hosted rituals. It was a system that required maintenance, tuning, and activation. Lost records referencing the awakening of the stone rings suggest that ancient Rome understood this consciously. They did not stumble into these effects accidentally. They noticed them, named them, and attempted to control them, and that is likely why the records were lost. When a civilization collapses, it leaves behind ruins, not instructions. Knowledge of how to awaken a structure like the Colosseum would be dangerous in the wrong hands, or embarrassing to later authorities who wanted to frame the past as barbaric rather than sophisticated. It is easier to say the games were cruel entertainment than to admit they were psychological and ritual technology. The most unsettling possibility is this. The Colosseum may not feel powerful today because it is broken. The rings are exposed, the floor removed, the system interrupted. What remains is a shell, a sleeping giant. but ancient people stood within it when it was whole, sealed, saturated with sound and blood and belief. They felt something we no longer can. They sensed the stone responding, the rings humming, the space thickening. If those lost records are even partially true, then the Colosseum was never just a monument. It was a tuned instrument. And like any instrument, it had to be awakened before it could be played. The question that lingers is not whether the stone rings were awakened. It is whether they ever truly went back to sleep. Ancient Roman records mention earthquakes with a specificity that becomes deeply unsettling when you isolate the locations they describe. Not regional quakes, not citywide tremors, but localized seismic disturbances that seem to cluster around a single structure, the amphitheater itself, the Colosseum. Stones shaking while surrounding districts remain comparatively calm. Walls vibrating without widespread collapse. People reporting ground movement confined to the arena and its immediate vicinity. To a modern reader, this sounds impossible. Earthquakes do not respect architecture. And yet, the records persist. Roman chroniclers were meticulous when it came to omens. They documented unusual phenomena, not as accidents, but as messages. When the earth moved beneath the Colosseum, it was not dismissed as coincidence. It was interpreted as response, reaction, something beneath the structure stirring. Several texts describe tremors felt during or shortly after major games. Crowds already primed by sound, violence, and emotion, suddenly experiencing the ground shudder beneath their feet. Panic followed. Some fled, others froze. Officials halted events. Priests were summoned. Sacrifices performed. This is not how Romans reacted to normal earthquakes. This is how they reacted to signs. What makes these accounts disturbing is their localization. Writers note that nearby temples remained stable, houses did not collapse, markets continued functioning. Yet the amphitheater shook, columns rattled, stone groaned. To the Roman mind, this meant the structure itself was involved. The ground was not randomly unstable, it was activated. Modern geology offers no easy explanation for such selective seismicity, but modern physics does. Structures can amplify vibration. Resonance can concentrate energy. When a system is repeatedly excited at or near its natural frequency, small inputs produce large effects. This is how bridges collapse under rhythmic footsteps. This is how buildings sway during specific seismic waves while others remain standing. Now imagine a structure as massive as the Colosseum, subjected repeatedly to intense low-frequency sound, synchronized human movement, rhythmic chanting, mechanical lifts, pounding drums, and the bioelectric output of tens of thousands of bodies. This is not a passive load. This is dynamic excitation. Over time, energy accumulates. Stress redistributes. The structure and the ground beneath it become coupled. Ancient observers may not have known the mathematics, but they felt the result. Some Roman engineers warned that excessive games weaken the ground. Not metaphorically, physically. They noted settling, cracking, unusual vibrations. Repairs were frequent. Reinforcements added. Iron clamps embedded. Why so much concern if the structure was merely hosting events? Because the events were doing something to the site. There are references to the earth answering the cries. A poetic phrase, yes. But poetry is often how cultures encode phenomena they cannot explain technically. When thousands scream in unison inside a stone vessel, the sound pressure does not vanish. It transmits downward, into foundations, into soil. Repeated often enough, this becomes a form of mechanical drilling. Not sudden, but cumulative. Add blood to this picture, warm fluids seeping into ground layers, chemical changes, microfractures, moisture altering soil stability. Vibration plus saturation is a known recipe for ground instability. Modern soil liquefaction occurs under far less dramatic circumstances. The Colosseum experienced this cycle repeatedly for centuries. Yet the Romans framed these tremors not as engineering failures, but as omens, warnings that something beneath the arena was unsettled. Some believed the underworld itself was reacting, others believed gods were displeased, but a few accounts suggest a more unsettling belief, that the structure had been overused, overstimulated, that the rituals had gone too far. There are mentions of temporary bans following tremors, days of silence imposed on the arena, ritual cleansings performed underground. These actions suggest an attempt not to repair stone, but to calm something, to reduce excitation, to let the ground settle, not just physically, but symbolically. One particularly chilling fragment describes a tremor occurring without warning during a lull in combat. No stampede, no drums, no collective movement. Just a sudden shudder, as if the ground exhaled. The writer notes that it felt as though something turned beneath us. That is not earthquake language. That is organism language. Skeptics argue that these were natural quakes misattributed, but if so, why are they described so narrowly? Why does the pattern repeat? Why do writers emphasize the amphitheater specifically? Romans experienced earthquakes elsewhere. They knew the difference. This was different. When Christianity rose and the games ceased, the tremors stopped being mentioned. Not because earthquakes ceased, but because the context vanished. No more rituals, no more crowds, no more synchronized excitation. The system went quiet. Silence is a powerful dampener. Later, medieval writers described the Colosseum as structurally unstable, but seismically quiet. It crumbled slowly, not violently, stones removed, arches collapsed over centuries, but no sudden shaking, no localized tremors. Whatever caused the earlier disturbances was no longer present. This suggests a disturbing possibility. The earthquakes were not purely geological. They were emergent phenomena, the result of human activity interacting with architecture and ground in a feedback loop. A loop that only existed when the system was active. If the Colosseum functioned as a resonance engine, acoustic, emotional, psychological, then the ground beneath it was part of that system. Energy does not disappear. It transfers. When sound cannot escape upward, it travels downward. When emotion cannot dissipate individually, it compresses collectively. When blood saturates soil repeatedly, it changes its properties. Combine these factors and the earth responds. Ancient people interpreted this response spiritually. Modern readers dismiss it. But dismissal does not erase pattern. Localized seismic activity around ritual sites appears in other cultures as well. Stone circles, temples, pyramids. Places where mass ritual occurred often carry legends of ground movement, humming, trembling. These legends persist because they were experienced, not imagined. The Colosseum may have been one of the most extreme examples of this phenomenon ever constructed, not because Rome intended to cause earthquakes, but because it unintentionally discovered how human systems can interact with physical systems in nonlinear ways. Push a system hard enough, long enough, and it behaves differently. The most unsettling thought is this: the Colosseum may have been stressing the earth itself, not breaking it, but agitating it, like tapping repeatedly on the same spot until something beneath begins to shift. If that is true, then the earthquakes were not warnings from gods, they were feedback. The system signaling strain, the ground saying enough. And if ancient Rome ignored that feedback, continued escalating violence, sound, and ritual intensity, then the eventual collapse of the system was not moral punishment. It was inevitable instability. Because no system, physical or psychological, can be driven indefinitely without consequence. The earth beneath the Colosseum may have trembled, not because Rome angered the gods, but because Rome discovered too late that stone, ground, and human consciousness are not separate. They resonate together. And when resonance reaches critical mass, even the ground begins to move. Beneath the ruined floor of the Colosseum, archaeologists have occasionally encountered discoveries that do not fit cleanly into the standard narrative of Roman engineering. Not weapons, not coins, not decorative fragments, but clusters of metallic objects embedded where they should not logically be, beneath wooden flooring, sealed under stone layers, placed deliberately rather than dropped or lost. These finds are rarely highlighted, often explained away as construction debris or reinforcement hardware. Yet, when examined collectively, they raise a deeply unsettling question. Why was so much metal intentionally hidden under the arena floor? Roman construction did use metal, but sparingly and visibly. Iron clamps were used to bind stone blocks. Nails secured wooden platforms. Hardware had purpose and placement. What troubles researchers is that some metallic objects beneath the arena do not align with structural necessity. They were not load-bearing. They were not accessible for maintenance. Some were placed in symmetrical patterns. Others were buried beneath layers that would never be reopened. This suggests intention beyond practicality. Ancient cultures did not view metal the way we do today. Metal was not just material, it was power condensed. It conducted not only electricity, but meaning. Iron, bronze, and copper were believed to interact with invisible forces, planetary influence, divine presence, protective energy. This belief was not fringe, it was foundational. Mars, Rome's most important god, was not only associated with war, but with iron itself. The metal was sacred, alive with force. Hidden metal in ritual sites is not unique to Rome. Temples across the ancient world embedded metal objects beneath floors, altars, and foundations, not for strength, but for activation. Metal was believed to attract, store, or redirect unseen currents. In modern terms, we might call these electromagnetic interactions. In ancient terms, they were simply power. The Colosseum's underground environment was ideal for such use, enclosed, layered, saturated with vibration and sound. If stone was the body, metal would be the nervous system, conductive pathways embedded within resonant material. This combination is not accidental. It is how you amplify subtle effects. Some reports describe metal rings, rods, and plates found aligned along corridors beneath the arena, not random scatter. Alignment, pattern. These objects were often removed quickly, cataloged poorly, or reburied. Why? Because they complicate the story. They suggest that the Colosseum was not only architecturally sophisticated, but energetically engineered. Metal responds to vibration. Sound waves can induce resonance in metallic objects, causing them to hum, amplify, or redistribute energy. Low-frequency sound, in particular, interacts strongly with metal. Now imagine tens of thousands of voices, drums, and screams striking a space embedded with hidden metal elements. The structure would not merely echo, it would behave. Ancient engineers may not have known electromagnetic theory, but they observed effects. They noticed that certain materials changed how spaces felt, that rooms with metal embedded behaved differently acoustically and psychologically. Ritual knowledge evolves through observation, not equations. There is also the matter of secrecy. Roman ritual practice often separated public spectacle from hidden mechanics. What the crowd saw was not what powered the event. Priests and engineers worked below ground. Activation occurred out of sight. Hidden metal would fit perfectly into this logic. You do not reveal the mechanism of awe, you conceal it. Some late Roman Christian writers accuse pagan engineers of burying instruments to deceive the senses. This phrase is vague, but telling. Instruments buried, deception of senses. These accusations were meant to ridicule pagan practices, but they accidentally preserve a truth. Something was hidden, and it did something. Metal buried beneath a ritual space could serve multiple functions. It could ground energy. It could focus vibration. It could create zones of heightened sensation. Humans standing above such zones might feel unease, awe, or emotional intensity, without knowing why. Sensation without explanation is the most powerful kind. This also reframes the idea of the field beneath the arena. A field does not exist without structure. Fields require boundaries, conductors, and inputs. Stone provides mass. Metal provides conductivity. Human bodies provide energy. Sound provides excitation. Blood provides chemical and symbolic reinforcement. Together, they form a system. Why hide the metal? Because exposure weakens myth. If people see the mechanism, the effect collapses. Rome thrived on the illusion of inevitability. Power felt natural, cosmic, ordained. Hidden metal ensured that the structure itself participated invisibly. There is a chilling parallel here to modern technology. We hide wires in walls. We bury cables underground. We conceal antennas. Not because they are shameful, but because function does not require visibility. Rome may have been doing the same, embedding its technology of influence beneath stone and spectacle. When later generations dismantled the Colosseum, stripping metal for reuse, something else vanished with it. The system broke. The hum stopped. The resonance collapsed. What remained was stone without circuitry. A shell. This may explain why the Colosseum today feels imposing, but inert. Awe without presence. Grandeur without charge. Ancient people felt something there that we do not. Because we are standing in a deactivated system. Hidden metallic objects under the arena floor were not mistakes. They were components. Quiet, unseen, essential. They remind us that ancient Rome may have understood something profoundly uncomfortable, that influence does not always operate through force or visibility, but through subtle interaction between material, environment, and the human nervous system. If that is true, then the Colosseum was not merely a place where events happened. It was a device, and the metal buried beneath its floor was part of how it worked. The most unsettling question is not what those objects were. It is what they were meant to do to the people standing above them. When you strip away the marble, the myths, and the centuries of romanticized brutality, one question refuses to disappear. Was the Colosseum simply a venue for spectacle, or was it something far more experimental? A controlled environment where Rome learned how to shape the emotional states of massive human populations in real time. Because what happened inside the Colosseum was not chaotic, it was repeatable. And repeatability is the signature of testing. Rome did not stumble blindly into mass influence. It observed, it refined, it escalated. The Colosseum provided something no civilization before it had ever possessed at such scale. A sealed architectural container capable of holding tens of thousands of people, synchronizing their attention, overwhelming their senses, and subjecting them to carefully timed emotional stimuli. That is not entertainment. That is a laboratory. Look at the variables. The crowd size was known and controlled. Entry points regulated flow. Seating tiers stratified social hierarchy. Sound behavior was predictable. Events followed strict sequences. Even the weather was considered when scheduling games. Nothing was random. Rome was watching not just the arena, but the audience. Ancient accounts describe officials studying crowd reactions closely. When cheers rose too quickly, events were delayed. When boredom crept in, violence intensified. When panic spread, rituals intervened. This is feedback control, input, response, adjustment. Exactly how modern behavioral experiments operate. The Colosseum allowed Rome to test how fear spreads, how excitement peaks, how long attention can be held, how empathy can be suppressed, and how identity dissolves in crowds. Gladiators were not the true subjects. Spectators were. Consider emotional escalation. Early games were relatively simple. Over time, they grew more elaborate, more violent, more theatrical. This mirrors habituation curves in psychology. Once an audience adapts to a stimulus, intensity must increase to achieve the same emotional response. Rome learned this empirically. They watched thresholds shift. They also learned emotional conditioning. Regular attendees reportedly became less disturbed by violence, more unified in reaction, more loyal to authority. This is classic desensitization combined with group bonding. People who shared intense emotional experiences together formed stronger collective identity. The Colosseum manufactured those experiences repeatedly. But the most disturbing element is predictability. Crowds began responding before events occurred. Gasps before trapdoors opened. Silence before executions. Anticipation synchronized across thousands. This means the crowd had learned the emotional rhythm. Their nervous systems were trained. Rome had successfully programmed expectation. That is mass emotional control. Modern psychology calls this entrainment, the alignment of emotional and cognitive states through repeated rhythmic stimuli. The Colosseum provided rhythm everywhere: chants, drums, marching feet, timed appearances, repeated symbols, architectural repetition. Even the calendar reinforced it. Games occurred on ritual days. Emotion became cyclical, predictable. Once emotion becomes predictable, it becomes controllable. Rome did not need propaganda the way modern states do. It did not need constant messaging. It needed calibration. The Colosseum calibrated the population emotionally. It vented aggression safely. It reinforced hierarchy visually. It normalized obedience to fate and authority. People learned, at a bodily level, where they stood. This also explains why Rome tolerated extreme violence in this space but not elsewhere. The Colosseum was contained. Emotion was allowed to explode there so it could remain muted outside. This is pressure management. Release valves prevent systemic instability. There is evidence that after major unrest, games increased, not decreased. Rome responded to instability not with speeches, but with spectacle. Emotional saturation reduces political agitation. A population exhausted by intense collective experience is less likely to rebel. That is not coincidence. That is strategy. Was Rome consciously running experiments? Not in the modern scientific sense, but civilizations test through repetition. Practices that stabilize society persist. Those that don't disappear. The Colosseum lasted centuries because it worked. It worked too well. When Christianity rose, it did not just challenge Roman gods, it challenged Roman emotional infrastructure. It removed ritual violence. It removed mass synchronization. It replaced shared spectacle with individual conscience. The Colosseum lost its function overnight because its true purpose, emotional control, was no longer ideologically acceptable. A stadium without emotional permission is just stone. So was the Colosseum a testing site? If a testing site is defined as a place where variables are controlled, responses observed, and systems refined, then yes, absolutely. Rome learned how humans behave in crowds, how fear overrides empathy, how rhythm overrides reason, how symbols override logic, how identity dissolves, how loyalty is felt, not argued. Those lessons did not vanish with Rome. Modern stadiums, political rallies, concerts, and mass media all follow the same principles, just with better technology and fewer lions. The Colosseum was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. And the most unsettling realization is this: Rome may not have fully understood why it worked, but it knew that it worked, and that was enough. Because once you learn how to control emotion at scale, you no longer need chains. You only need rhythm.